going to start then with some of what economists call stylized facts. These are very convenient things for people who aren't really scientists, but have some pretensions of that direction. A stylized fact is a statement that isn't exactly true, but there's enough truth in it to be getting on with for the time being. And I'm going to talk about, give you some stylized facts about prosperity in the world today. I want to define rich countries as countries that have incomes per head more than half the level of the richest country in the world at the time. And I'm going to knock out, for these purposes, countries with a population under 2 million, because I want to be rid of. It's slightly dicey because you may have noticed just down the road the embassy in Spain of the United Arab Emirates, which is actually one of the countries I want to knock out of this for these purposes. I want to remove, as it were, Luxembourg and Monaco and Qatar and the UAE and talk about, as it were, countries that have significant populations and economies of the kind we recognize. So a rich country, in my terms, is a country that has an income per head of more than half the level of the richest country in the world. And under my definitions, the richest country in the world today would be Norway. And there are about 20 states that have incomes per head of more than half that level. This is the group of rich countries in the world today. And one of the interesting things which we'll develop, I think, in the course of what we have to talk about this morning, is that it's almost always the case that if a country joins that group of rich countries over the 200 years that economic growth has been widespread in the world, over these 2 centuries, once a country gets to the level of being a rich country, it stays there. The majority of rich countries in these terms are, of course, in Western Europe. There's 2 North American countries, Canada and the United States. There's Australia. There are 2 or 3, depending on whether you call Hong Kong a country or not. Singapore and Japan in Asia come into that group. And that's it. The 2 countries which don't fulfill the condition I fulfilled, they've been in that group and dropped out of it. Anyone have ideas about what they are? Country?
Argentina?
Argentina's one. Argentina was, some people claim it was the richest country in the world. It's nothing like that. But it was among that rich group in the late 19th century. And is not there anymore. There are 2 others, right, both of which have been, one of which has been relatively rich and is now teetering on the edge, the other of which comes in and out. One of them's in Europe and one's not. New Zealand is the conspicuous failure in this. Some of that's Britain's fault. We joined the EU and took away what was the dominant market for its agricultural products. They then compounded this external disaster with internal disasters, having first of all a kind of aggressively protectionist internal experiment, which didn't work, and then an aggressively deregulatory experiment, which also didn't work very well. And that took New Zealand pretty much out of that group of rich countries. And the other, of course, is Italy, which barely came in and barely stays out again. And then behind that, there's a group of countries that are kind of knocking on the door of the rich countries club. Spain is one. It's not there. It could be there. South Korea is another. Taiwan, again, if we call that a country, is one. 2 of the released countries of Eastern Europe, Poland and the Czech Republic. That's stylized facts about who's rich and who's poor. Now, my rich group are distinguished by a whole load of other characteristics, most of which are probably caused by high incomes rather than being the causes of high incomes. For example, population of rich countries is taller than the population of poor countries. That's probably caused by incomes via diet, although some of you will know there is evidence, for example, that CEOs are on average taller than the population as a whole. But I guess the causality in that runs one in that direction. So does the correlation from how rich a country is to indicators of quality of its environment in terms of water quality, air pollution in cities, and so on. But there are one or two things that are rather strong correlations, but don't seem to be caused by income per head in any sense. Any thoughts about what they are? Things that distinguish these rich countries, Western Europe, Canada and the United States, Australia.
Rule of law.
Sorry?
Rule of law.
The rule of law is certainly part of it, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a moment. Sorry?
Democracy.
And democracy is also one. We're putting together a story that has this, a product of institutions, and that's something we'll develop. Think of something that has nothing to do with man-made institutions at all. Resources is interesting, but it's interesting for what it doesn't say, that these countries are not distinguished by having more resources rather than less. Norway, which I pointed out as the richest of these countries, is actually at the top because Norway has exceptional resources, and resources help one or two other countries like Canada and Australia in that group as well, but they're not primarily what's behind the wealth of Canada and Australia. And interestingly, Norway is the striking case of a country that has extraordinary resource wealth and actually manages to handle that resource wealth rather well. One can point to many poorer countries in the world where resources, actually many development economists talk about the resource curse, that actually having plentiful natural resources in many countries has tended to reduce standards of living rather than to increase them, because it attracts. There's a combination. Yeah, right, absolutely. What makes these countries rich is a combination of factors. But there's one oddity, actually, which I think was mentioned over here, which is climate. You know, one of the things about all these countries is that they're cold. And that goes through, you know, line by line. You know, if we look across Europe, it gets worse as you go south. Italy, I described as a country that was on the edge of my rich country group. Actually, if I were to split Italy into two and have a northern Italy and a southern Italy, there wouldn't be any argument about it. Northern Italy would be clearly among the rich countries, and southern Italy wouldn't be. The same might well be true in the United States. If the Confederacy had actually won, even after 150 years, it's still true, as Michael noted, that the Confederate states in the US are on average markedly poorer than the rest of the United States.